Hey, everybody, and welcome to the 5 Bytes podcast. I'm your host, Rory Monahan. Coming up on this week's episode, there has been many reports of customers saying their Server 2019 and Server 2022 machines have been automatically upgrading to Server 2025. Also, I will feature a roundup of the Patch Tuesday news. And Microsoft has announced a change coming for Windows updates in December. For this and more, keep listening to this episode of the podcast, which of course, as always, is brought to you by my sponsors. And that includes Numecent, the inventors of the first and only cloud-native container management platform for Windows desktops. And of course, also brought to you by Master Packager, who make an application packaging software that helps you build packages that end users love, enterprises want, and the Windows OS needs. If you enjoy the show each week, you have these awesome sponsors to thank. And now for some news. This week saw Patch Tuesday once again, and this month sees 91 vulnerabilities patched, including 4 0 days, 2 of which are actively being exploited. A total roundup of the vulnerabilities patched this month includes 26 elevation of privilege vulnerabilities, 2 security feature bypass vulnerabilities, 52 remote code execution vulnerabilities, 1 information disclosure vulnerability, 4 denial of service vulnerabilities, and 3 spoofing vulnerabilities. I'm not going to go through all of the vulnerabilities or even all of the 0 days because there's quite a lot to get through, but I will share an article that covers some of the highlights with this episode, which is episode 360, and you can find that at 5bytespodcast.com. But just to highlight a couple, I saw CVE-2024-49039, which is a Windows Task Scheduler elevation of privilege vulnerability. By leveraging this vulnerability, a specially crafted application could be executed that elevates privileges to medium integrity level. Microsoft says that exploiting this vulnerability would allow attackers to execute RPC functions that are normally restricted to privileged accounts. This is one of the vulnerabilities that has been leveraged in exploits in actual attacks, but it's not known how the flaw has been exploited, or at least it hasn't been shared. Another vulnerability worth highlighting is CVE-2024-49019, and this is an Active Directory Certificate Services Elevation of Privilege vulnerability. Attackers could gain domain admin privileges by abusing built-in default version 1 certificate templates. So essentially, if you created certificates using a version 1 certificate template where the source of the subject name is set to supplied in the request, and the enroll permissions are granted to a broader set of accounts, such as domain users or domain computers, such as with the built-in web server template, an attacker could craft a CSR to include application policies that are preferred over the configured extended key attributes specified in the template. This could be used to generate client authentication, certificate request agents, and code signing certificates using the web server template, essentially leveraging this vulnerability and this template to craft these certificates that can be used in attacks. And of course, as usual, other vendors have supplied their own updates in line with Patch Tuesday, such as the likes of Adobe, HPE, and Palo Alto, and more. Microsoft issued a notification on their Windows Update Twitter account stating that because of minimal operations during the Western holidays, there will be no December 2024 non-security preview update. There will be a monthly security update for 2024, and normal monthly servicing for non-security and security updates will resume in January 2025. So interesting, they're changing the cadence this year for the holidays, which is probably not surprising if you listen to this podcast regularly over the years, because I had been reporting that it seemed like the number of vulnerabilities patched over last year at least was significantly lower around the holidays. So it makes sense to maybe focus their efforts on patching the security vulnerabilities this time around and maybe forget some of the non-security related updates during the holidays. It also will hopefully lead to less chance of disruption and breakages caused by the updates. Windows Server 2025, which I've talked about on previous episodes of the podcast, became generally available on November 1st after a pretty lengthy period in preview. It includes features that I covered before, such as next-gen Active Directory, storage performance boost that I know Ned Pyle talked quite a bit about. He also talked about SMB security hardening, and Of course, the very welcome hot patching that I feel like I've been talking about for 2 years now. Well, the release of Server 2025 quickly went from an occasion of curiosity and excitement for IT pros as many reports started hitting the internet about administrators claiming their Server 2019 and Server 2022 machines started to upgrade themselves to Server 2025. Microsoft claimed that some devices upgraded automatically to Server 2025 using KB 5044284, which is an optional update for those who do want to upgrade to 2025 using a Windows Update. And this was pushed, unfortunately, by some third-party products that some customers use to manage the updates of clients and servers. So essentially, it seems they're saying that third-party products that can be used to manage Windows updates accidentally or erroneously pushed KB 5044284 to Server 2022 and Server 2019 machines in some organizations and upgraded them to Server 2025. Microsoft said the update used a deployment action equals optional installation tag, indicating that patch management tools should have interpreted it as an optional update rather than as a recommended update that should be deployed. But it seems something went wrong. Some organizations moved to set policies via group policies to block the KB in question, but were unfortunately too late in some instances to prevent some of the servers in the estate from upgrading. This affected many organizations, which is likely why Microsoft provided an advisory on a Saturday, and there has been no fix or solution to seamlessly roll back to Server 2019 or Server 2022 in a non-disruptive way, at least at this time. If you were not impacted by this yet, you should be okay at this point. Microsoft says it resolved another issue where administrators were offered to upgrade to Server 2025 via a banner on their device's Windows Update page under Settings. And the company added that this message was intended for those wanting to do an in-place upgrade, but obviously putting that there is a little bit risky if someone perhaps erroneously clicks on it, or maybe a junior administrator just clicks on it without knowing what it is and completely bricks a server. So yeah, definitely a pretty bad incident here, and hopefully those listening were not affected by it. If you were, I'd love to hear what you're doing about it. Are you just sticking on Server 2025? Are you trying to downgrade again, or even just rebuilding your server? Microsoft has confirmed that last month's Windows updates are breaking SSH connections on some Windows 11 22H2 and 23H2 systems. BleepyComputer.com reports that when confirming, Microsoft stated only a limited number of devices are impacted. And Bleepy Computer has shared a list of steps that you can use to manually mitigate the issue while waiting for a permanent solution if you would like, and I'll share a link to that with this episode. Microsoft has made .NET Framework version 9 generally available, and it includes thousands of performance, security, and functional improvements. According to NeoWin.net, .NET Framework version 9 can now process 15% more requests compared to .NET 8. Accompanying the .NET 9 release, Microsoft announced the release of Visual Studio 2022 17.12 that also brings significant performance improvements, improved debugging and diagnostics, and better integration with .NET Aspire, analyzer support for C#13, improved Git support, and more. As .NET Framework version 9 enters the frame, .NET Framework version 6 has now reached end of support. And thanks to Yoel for pointing this one out because I had no idea. .NET 7 went out of support earlier this year, so that's a couple of different versions of .NET Framework gone within the same calendar year. So if you're on either of those versions still, time to upgrade, because obviously these are very critical components that are typically updated by Windows updates, and they will not be updated in future. According to PCWorld.com, Microsoft will pull support for the Windows Mail, Calendar, and People apps on December 31st of this year, which is obviously just a few weeks away now. The classic Outlook app is also on track to be deprecated, but it has a longer timeline, with Microsoft intending to gradually force users to the new Outlook app. So personally, I think it's about time the Windows Mail app at least gets retired, because if anything, it's just a nuisance it being there in the OS. It just adds confusion. So I think this is a positive change, and hopefully it won't impact too many people once it goes away. Google has announced that multi-factor authentication will be mandatory on all cloud accounts for both administrators and users by the end of 2025. They say to ensure a smooth transition, Google Cloud will provide advanced notification to enterprises and users along the way to help plan MFA deployments. The change will unfold through 3 different phases in the course of the next year or so to ease the transition for impacted users. Google says the mandatory MFA requirement for Google Cloud users is being done to increase security, and sees this as a critical step for safeguarding accounts from increasingly sophisticated threats that can compromise sensitive data and cause significant damage. Sleepycomputer.com reported that Google has cited research from the US CISA showing that MFA makes users 99% less likely to get hacked, and notes that its own data corroborates the US government agency's findings. The US CISA has warned that attackers are exploiting a critical missing authentication vulnerability in Palo Alto Networks Expedition, which is a migration tool that can help convert firewall configuration from Check Point, Cisco, and other vendors to Palo Alto's PAN OS. This security flaw is tracked as CVE-2024-5910, and it was patched in July, but threat actors can remotely exploit it to reset application admin credentials on internet-exposed Expedition servers. Admins who cannot immediately install security updates to block incoming attacks are advised to restrict Expedition network access to authorized users, hosts, or networks. But seeing as though this was patched all the way back in July, I don't think there's any excuse for not patching at the moment. You've had months, and it kind of, at this point, if you're left vulnerable to this, it's likely your own fault. Get a move on. 2 vulnerabilities have been disclosed in the Citrix NetScaler ADC and NetScaler Gateway. The affected versions for the vulnerabilities include ADC and Gateway version 14.1 before 14.1-29.72, NetScaler ADC and Gateway 13.1 before 13.1-55.34, ADC 13.1-FIPS before 13.1-37.207, ADC 12.1-FIPS before 12.1-55.321, and NetScaler ADC 12.1-NDCPP before 12.1-55.321. And I regret reading out all of that. I should have just pointed you to the article, but I was in it already. Of course, if you're still running on versions like 12.1 and 13, those are end of life, and you need to upgrade to a supported version. The security bulletin by Citrix is CTX 691608, and it only applies to customer-managed NetScaler ADC and NetScaler Gateway. So if you're using the cloud services, obviously those are going to be updated by Citrix and should not be vulnerable. The vulnerabilities in this case are specifically CVE-2024-8534, which is a memory safety vulnerability that leads to memory corruption and denial of service. And this vulnerability has a few prerequisites. The appliance must be configured as a gateway with RDP feature enabled, or the appliance must be configured as a gateway and RDP proxy server profile is created and set to gateway, or the appliance must be configured as an auth server with RDP feature enabled. This one has a severity score of 8.4 out of 10. The other vulnerability is CVE-2024-8535. With this vulnerability, an authenticated user can access unintended user capabilities. And the prerequisites for this vulnerability is that the appliance must be configured as a gateway with KCD account configuration for Kerbos SSO to access backend resources, or the appliance must be configured as an auth server with KCD account configuration for Kerbos SSO to access backend resources. And this vulnerability has a severity score of 5.8 out of 10. As you might expect, the recommendation is to get on the newly released patched versions of these products. And Citrix has provided a list of steps that you could do to check to see if you are vulnerable and if you meet those prerequisites, which if you're a Citrix administrator, I certainly suggest that you check to see if you're vulnerable, and of course also patch timely. Microsoft has acknowledged an issue causing macOS applications to hang when opening or saving files in OneDrive. The issue only impacts systems running macOS Sequoia, which is the newly released macOS version. Microsoft said opening or saving files within desktop or documents folders can cause the files app to freeze, and this occurs on macOS 15, like I just said. Until a fix is available, customers should force quit the open and save panel service process that hangs because of this issue and save their files to a location other than their desktops, documents, or OneDrive folders. BleepingComputer.com has reported that Microsoft is adding a share button to pretty much everything within Windows 11, including in the Start menu. By Start menu in a Windows 11 context, I mean the menu that can show recently accessed files or recommended files, and not just the actual Start menu shortcuts from the applications. And in those recommended files or recently accessed files, you can right-click and share the file right from that Start menu. VMware has announced that its VMware Fusion and VMware Workstation desktop hypervisors are now free to everyone for commercial, educational, and personal use. This is a move I reported on a few months ago, I believe, but it has now come to pass, and you can download VMware Fusion and VMware Workstation at support.broadcom.com after you sign in using a Broadcom account. Speaking of VMware, Ars Technica recently reported on Broadcom launching the VMware vSphere Enterprise Plus subscription tier, which creates a more digestible bundle that's more appropriate for smaller customers. The introduction of vSphere Enterprise Plus at the end of last month means that customers who only want vSphere virtualization can now pick from two bundles instead of just one, which really wasn't suited to smaller organizations. The article goes on to suggest the move to launch this new tier is welcome, but it may be too little too late to change the minds of some who have started looking for the door after the Broadcom acquisition and that licensing change that had such a sticker shock for some. Just a quick hit here, Citrix, CTP, and CTA applications are now open for the next year. So if you'd like to contribute to two really great programs, the Citrix CTP and CTA programs, apply now. The S&P Dow Jones announced that Nvidia will replace Intel in the Dow Jones Industrial Average, making it a seismic shift in the semiconductor industry and ending Intel's nearly 25-year run on the stock market index. The move to track Nvidia in place of Intel suggests what everyone can already see in plain sight. Intel has been a company in decline in recent years, while Nvidia has been riding a rocket ship in terms of success and valuation. Intel's stock has dropped 54% this year, making it the worst performer on the Dow, and the company now holds a market value of under $100 billion for the first time in 3 decades. Analysts expect Intel to post its first annual net loss since 1986, according to Ars Technica. OpenAI has reportedly acquired the domain chat.com. HubSpot's founder and CTO, Dharmesh Shah, purchased chat.com for $15.5 million in early 2023, but Shah has now sold the domain to OpenAI for an undisclosed amount, though he confirmed on Twitter that he doesn't like profiting off people he considers friends, and that he received payment in company shares by revealing he is now an investor in OpenAI, which, considering the company, I think you're profiting. You're not profiting off of friends by taking, I guess, money out of the company, but you're going to profit on the back end because OpenAI is a pretty significant company to hold shares in. But now this episode's scripts, tricks, and tips. Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance shared a list of the most exploited vulnerabilities and relevant links to the National Vulnerability Database entries, and it's definitely worth review. And I'll share that with this episode if you want to see kind of what the hot vulnerabilities were for this year. Next up, the awesome James Kindon shared a blog post that he published this week on the evolution of Citrix Workspace Environment Management Service. So if you haven't used WEM yet, you should really check it out and check out this article to see how it has evolved and the obvious investment in its enhancements and development recently. Finally, If you're in Ireland or Dublin this week, specifically Thursday, come along to EUC Ireland. We have a great lineup of speakers there. I'm going to be there as a representative for Numescent as we're sponsoring the event, but I know Thomas Popelgard's going to be there. Some of the Citrix team is going to be there, and more. So register to attend that, and I'll see you there. But that's it for this week's episode. Thanks so much for listening.